Hello, and welcome to another daily devotional focused on experiencing God, knowing and doing the will of God, a workbook that we are in week 4 following through. This is the last day, the 5th day of week 4. Just as a quick reminder, as you finish up, Saturday is a day of rest, and Sunday is as well. Saturday is a day of rest, Sunday is a day of worship. But I encourage you over those days to read back through the summaries, look back through your notes, just take some time to review that. Look at where you've gone over these first 4 weeks. If you're just joining us, that gives you some time to catch up as well. Today, it is about knowing where God is at work, how we get to know that. And there are several points in this that are very, very helpful. One is that there are ways that we can see things that are unmistakably God's. God's work, God's action, God's word, unmistakably so. And I often pray for that. I pray for God to let us know what is unmistakably God's will in our lives. And so there are ways that we can miss God. You would think God being God, we wouldn't miss. If God were doing something, we couldn't miss it. But God is not one that flaunts everything. God invites you by letting you see, but it is possible to turn away and to ignore God and not to pay attention or to explain things away. So today we spend a little bit more time unpacking the verse, but mostly it is about understanding that there are things that only God can do. And there are two particular points at the end of this that jumped out at me when I was doing the studies, and I hope that they will mean something to you. First is, when you see God and know where God is working, that the time to join God is at that moment. That's not to say that you can see God doing something and God will be doing it for a long time. That's possible. What it tells us is that when we do know that God is doing something, when it is clear that God is doing something that only God can do, and what we see is unmistakably God in our mind and our heart, we know that. Our job is not to sit around and just smile and think about that and say, that was really a good sermon. It's to do something about it. It's to take action to join God in what God is doing. The second point at the very end of this is that when God starts something, when God initiates something, God will finish it, and you should too. So if you reach this point where you find certainty, and the workbook today is going to help you flesh that out some and understand how we become more convinced that we do and can see what God is doing, that we know that that is there, that the closure of this is to know that if God has started it, it will happen. Now, for me, that becomes even more true as I think back over my ministry. In one church in particular, there were several of us in a men's group that had a vision of something that we believed God was about to do. It was really kind of supernatural, but it was definitely a movement that happened completely independent of each other. We saw something, and there was enough of a relationship we knew without a doubt that God had invited us into something. Now, here's the interesting part. We saw it at a very particular place, and it didn't happen in that place. What we found out was that when we shared it with others in the church, others weren't quite as enthusiastic. They hadn't seen it. And try as we could to convince people this is what we think we can do to join God in this work, there were a lot of people that were much more skeptical because they hadn't seen it. And so we were losing faith that it wasn't happening. And then I noticed through a pastor friend of mine in the same area that his church began doing exactly what we had envisioned God doing, but it was through his church, not ours. So there was some disappointment in that, of course, because we realized that we were getting that invitation. We had the chance to jump in there, and we missed that chance because God kept moving without us. But we were also in awe and became even more faithful because we realized that God, when God starts moving, there's no stopping God. I've always had an expression that God works in us, through us, or in spite of us. That was an in spite of us moment. We realized that, and that church that God accomplished that vision through is still doing well. And the church that I was part of is still a good church, taking care of one another, doing some community outreach. But what was most interesting to me was the fact that God's invitation was to us, and it was going to happen whether we joined God or not. So as you read through this today, think of ways that you can see when God is moving unmistakably, when you're certain of it. And then remember that story that I told. Remember what you read in this workbook session today. When you see what God is doing, when you are knowing where God is at work, don't hesitate, my friends. It's an invitation like none other. Now, be a blessing today. Have a wonderful day.